Occasions like this, people often ask, what should be the relative roles of state and market? What should government agencies do and what should be left to private companies? What I want to argue in the next half hour is that these boundaries are actually almost infinitely porous. The result that the questions are unhelpful. That's why I've given the title Hybrids as part of the description of this talk. What do I mean by hybrids? There's an organisation in the UK which probably most of you haven't heard of called UK Government Investments. And UK Government Investments holds what is described as the government stake in a variety of activities. These include Channel 4 Television, Companies House, the Post Office, the Royal Bank of Scotland, the Royal Mint, and Urenco. Urenco is probably the one you haven't heard of. All the others I would guess you have. Urenco is actually a British, Dutch, German consortium which makes centrifuges for concentrating uranium, the kind of thing that arouses so much controversy when Iran wants to make it or use it. But all of these have government stakes held by UK Government Investments. UK Government Investments is a rather strange organisation. It's actually basically a corporate finance boutique. It was modelled as if it were some kind of private equity house. But it's obvious if you list these organisations, Channel 4, Companies House, the Post Office, Royal Bank of Scotland, Royal Mint, and Urenco, in none of these is the reason for the government having a stake in this industry, essentially an investment motive. That is, none of them did the government think we'll make a lot of money if we buy these. The government holds them because they are organisations that have commercial characteristics on the one hand, but social functions and objectives on the other. That's the reason for the government involvement. And once I define a hybrid in that way, it's worth saying that most of them, not all, of the things on that list are registered as companies, like any other company, although some of them are so-called trading funds, which is a particular status which is established under a particular Trading Funds Act. Having listed these, you can see there are lots of other hybrids as well. There's the BBC, there's universities. These two categories are distinctive. There are a few others in that they're established under another organisational form. They're established by Royal Charter, and the charter has to be specific to the particular institution. Water and electricity, you all know of as utility services, water provision and distribution and electricity distribution are both natural monopolies, but these are provided by regulated companies registered under the Companies Act, companies with shareholders, shareholders who are not the government, but their activities are heavily regulated. Network Rail is a hybrid. It had a very curious structure until 2014-2015, in which there were so-called public interest members of the company, who were, as far as one could see, a fairly random selection of private individuals. Today there is only one member, which a Companies Act company has to have, of Network Rail, who is the Secretary of State for Transport. Then there are education academies. 2/3 of pupils in secondary schools in England today are educated in academies, which are organisations with a degree of autonomy. Most of them are parts of academy trusts, which are governed by a board of trustees. As I say, that accounts for the majority of education, secondary education in England. There are also, of course, NHS trusts. There are so-called special purpose vehicles, which are established for various particular private finance initiative, public-private partnership purposes. For example, one of the most bizarre is an organisation called Exchequer Partnerships, which purportedly has a long lease on the Treasury building, the one on Great George Street in the corner of Whitehall, which it was responsible for the refurbishment of, and it is now owned predominantly by funds controlled by Aberdeen Standard Investments. As I say, there is a shorter-term lease in which the Treasury and HMRC operates, although it's quite hard either to visualise the Treasury HMRC defaulting, or if they did default, Aberdeen Standard Investments moving in to occupy it. And then there are housing associations. If one takes the what I call hybrid sector as a whole, it accounts for, I reckon, about 25% of UK GDP. It's actually as big as the whole listed company sector in terms of its contribution to UK economic activity. So we're not talking about a small area of organisation. And in addition, there's a group of companies, you all know what they are, Serco, G4S, Capita. The one that has brought itself as recently to your attention is, of course, Carillion, because it collapsed. All of these are companies whose essential competitive advantage is in getting government contracts. It's not quite so clear they have a competitive advantage in performing public contracts, but they certainly have a competitive advantage in getting them. That's the hybrid sector, and it's the hybrid sector that I want to talk about today. And I want to talk about it as a sector, because having made the point that we have so many hybrids, what is immediately obvious is that we have essentially made rules, governance structures and the like ad hoc in almost every individual case. We have many different kinds of hybrids, they have many different kinds of organisations, structures, governance structures, but since we don't think of this sector as a whole, there is almost no read across that asks the question, what is working well and what is working badly in this sector? And that's the debate I want to start this morning. In relation to any one of these three organisations, there are three kinds of questions which I think we need to pose in understanding how they operate. The first is questions of how their finances are structured. It's the essence of all of these that they operate as essentially trading organisations. That is, they have revenues and expenditures. The revenues in the majority of cases come from user charges of various kinds, although in some cases, like the educational ones, the user charges are essentially paid directly or indirectly by government related to the volume of activity which is conducted. And all of them have to finance their own expenditures from these. So that they need to have capital budgets and they need to manage the risks associated with trading. They need some kind of capital expenditure program and they need to have some reserves. Secondly, there are questions, what is the governance structure of all of these? What are the mechanisms of management, appointment and accountability? And that management, the governance structure, needs to be responsible both for the financial aspects of the activities of the hybrid and the social aspects, because it's in the nature of any hybrid that both are parts of the measure of the quality of its performance. And thirdly, there has to be some kind of resolution process. What happens when the hybrid is unsuccessful, either in meeting its financial or its social obligations, or quite commonly, because the result when they're not working is typically the product of a failure of management, and it's often reflected in both weaknesses of financial control and failures of meeting social objectives. And as I say, there's an extraordinary variety of answers to all of these questions. Now, how does this arise? How do we have such a large hybrid sector? Well, part of the answer to that involves going back to look at the history of the development of the state. You'll remember it's a century ago since Weber provided a definition of a state, as essentially a state which exerts a monopoly of coercion within a particular set of geographical boundaries. And that was indeed the 19th century state. The main things the 19th century did were it exerted internal control. It ran a kind of police force or army to keep the population down, and it went up and beat up foreigners in various ways. And these were the characteristic functions of the 19th century state, external and internal coercion. But what a modern state mainly does, it delivers services. It provides health, education, and the like. These are, in fact, the largest activities in quantitative terms of a modern state, health and education. And the issues that arise in service provision are, I think, materially different from the issues that arise in the exercise of coercion. In the case of, if we ask what we want in terms of delivery of services, it's we want good services. When the state delivers rubbish, collects rubbish, we want the rubbish collected. We don't very much care about the process under which the rubbish is collected. But when the state is exercising its coercive functions, we do care a lot about the process. We want the police to go around arresting bad men, but we just don't want policemen to go around deciding who are good and bad men and arresting the ones they think are bad. We want them to operate under a very well-defined and elaborated process of rules and authorizations. And that's true in relation to tax collection. It might be a good idea, it sounds like a good idea, if we left the tax authorities to collect what they thought was fair, but a little thought suggests that that really isn't a very good idea. And it's an even worse idea to say you go and collect taxes in the most efficient way possible. We care in these areas a lot about the process. But when it comes to rubbish collection or health and education, what we want primarily is good medical care, good hospitals, good schools, and that's a lot more important than the process that delivers these kinds of output. So that's what has given rise to these to this totality of a hybrid sector. So let's go back to these questions, the ones we have to resolve in any structuring any particular hybrid, the questions of financial structure, of governance structure, and of resolution process. And in the main, I think we'll conclude that a lot of them don't work terribly well. What we're trying to achieve in structuring these is, first of all, that in almost all of these activities, what we want is to introduce something called, which I would call commercial disciplines into the operation. What do I mean by commercial disciplines? I mean the kind of things that any well-run private sector organization would naturally do. That means budgeting, ahead of time, actually having budgets in which you determine priorities for your expenditures. It means budgeting not just on an annual cycle, but actually in which you spend money that is left in the pot at the end of the year, but budgeting in which you accept that you're going to overspend relative to your budgets in some years and underspend in others, and you balance one with the other in some kind of reserving process. You also need, obviously, to plan your investment on a time scale longer than an annual budget cycle. And in relation to many of these hybrids, the relevant time scale for investment is very long indeed, even by private sector standards. So you need that aspect of commercial disciplines, financial disciplines of that kind. You also need essentially delegation of responsibility. You need to be able to give executive management overall executive responsibility for running the organization, and they need to feel empowered to delegate authority for what it is goes on within the organization to junior people within the organization. You can see that that is a critical difference in many ways between the hybrid and the traditional government agency, because for the reasons I described, the need to validate the process of coercive activity, you are very concerned in the latter case that there should be a paper trail, essentially, of accountability and authority. In the case of these kind of activities, you want to have much more ability to delegate responsibility in the first instance to your day-to-day management, and secondly to enable them to do it to the people who are actually providing the framework. All of that kind of delegation, which is a key to effective organisation, within the context of some overarching framework which blends the social and financial objectives of the organisation, the social and the financial, which balances the social and financial and doesn't give too much priority to one at the expense of the other. And the fourth characteristic which you want in an effectively managed hybrid, is you want to protect the hybrid against interest group capture. Because in the case of commercial organisation, we have, and I'll come to this in a moment, a relatively clear statement of, as it were, who it is who has ultimately responsibility. If you don't have that, then you are vulnerable to this phenomenon of interest group capture, or a different way of putting it would be to say that public limited companies are typically captured by particular interest groups who are shareholders, or in truth in modern public limited companies rather more often their executive management, particularly in the financial sector, which has become a major problem in the management of public companies. But more characteristic in the hybrid sector has been capture by one of two groups, either the private contractors who are actually providing the work. That's true in relation to some of the hybrids I was describing in relation to PFIs and the like, or they're vulnerable to employee capture. That is, schools and hospitals potentially have and often in reality, have the problem of being captured by the people who work in them. And universities probably have that in relatively extreme form. What we want to ensure is that there is a proper reflection in every hybrid of the broad social objectives, and that capture of the broad social objectives needs to be accomplished, I think, at the level of the overarching framework. Now, what we have in the case of the majority of private sector organisations is, as I've indicated, a simple structure which is provided under the Companies Act, or at least a well-defined structure which is provided under the Companies Act. You have shareholders who are the residual claimants on the income and assets. Shareholders notionally appoint the boards of the organisations, although the reality is that these boards are self-perpetuating, but they're not quite self-perpetuating because the threat of hostile takeover is in effect an opportunity in what has sometimes been called the market for corporate control to change the management of these organisations. So there are well-defined and described procedures, even if they're not in many cases ideal procedures, for answering the questions about financial structure and governance and accountability, which I've described. In the case of many of these hybrids, there simply is no such clarity. Some of the hybrids I've described, as I mentioned, are structured as companies. That is, they're registered organisations under the Companies Act. That raises questions as to who the shareholders are. And who the shareholders are in some cases, the Secretary of State. I described that in relation to Network Rail. There was an odd previous attempt to do it in relation to Network Rail. In relation to, that's the reality in relation to those hybrids that are structured as trading funds. In some cases, they're essentially non-existent private companies. The equity in the typical special purpose vehicle right in the hybrid sector is typically insignificant, and the real providers of finance are the debt holders. That is, if one takes what is perhaps the biggest failure so far under the private finance initiative, or one of the biggest failures, but I'll take that as an example, it would be the construction of a new national physical laboratory, which was undertaken by a special purpose vehicle. The special purpose vehicle made huge cost overruns, but the cost overruns essentially bankrupted John Lang, the construction company. They were in pretty bad state because they'd have a previous problem, as many of you will know, down the road at the Millennium Stadium. But it was the National Physical Laboratory that did for them in the long run. And the reason it did for them was that the essential financing of the project was provided by debt, it didn't need to be provided by the contractors, but it was provided by the contractors, and the main contractors was John Lang. So that in these special purpose vehicles, the reality is that the people who are taking the financial risk, if there is any in the operation, are the debt holders. These special purpose vehicles, however, are also registered under the Companies Act, so that I described Exchequer Partnerships, which is indeed a limited company under the Companies Act. The equity, as I've described, doesn't really matter in that organisation. The bulk of the financial interest is now held by an investment company on behalf of a group of pension funds. I mentioned that some organisations were subject to royal charter, notably the BBC and universities. The BBC is, of course, probably the highest profile possible hybrids, which means that the regular renewal of its royal charter is a matter of complexity and controversy. In 2007, a new royal charter established a separate BBC trust, which was supposed to monitor, well, to be honest, it wasn't quite clear what it was supposed to be monitoring. It was certainly to be monitoring the public interest functions of the BBC, but it also had some responsibility for its financial management. I think it's widely seen as not having performed either of these functions particularly well. And anyway, in 2007, the Royal Charter meant the disappearance of the BBC Trust and replacement by a single conventional management board, which is appointed de facto by the government. And if one looks at the structure of almost all of these boards, one has the feeling, looking at them, that the structure is much more directed to satisfying a variety of different political constituencies than it is to actually finding individuals who will be effective in the manner in which one would expect the directors of public limited companies to be effective, even if they're not always doing it. That is, there is, of course, on the BBC board, a member from Wales, a member for Scotland. There is a satisfactory representation of ethnic and other diversity on the board. I'm not against any of these things, but I think these are less important than having people in place who can actually do the very difficult job of oversight of complex organisations, a difficulty which is doubly raised when one has the duty of conflating and balancing the social obligations with the financial objectives. Universities have traditionally had a variety of structures. They're established, as I've described, under Royal Charter. That means that their governance provisions are written in to that particular Royal Charter. The historic metropolitan universities typically had governing boards, various titles, which typically consisted of a variety of local worthies, with executive management, insofar as the concept of executive management exists within the purview of a university, which is not very far, being provided essentially by the academics. That's what I described earlier as employee capture. However, there was relatively powerful oversight by the Higher Education Funding Council, which is also currently, interestingly, in process of being abolished. In fact, I think as of last week, it has finally disappeared, and oversight of the university sector is now provided by an office for students. Those functions I find quite difficult to identify clearly. And the financial side of university management appears to be left to universities themselves. There are only a couple of cases in the past of universities having effectively gone bust. One of them was down the road at University College Cardiff, a history which some of you may know rather more about than I do. And the more recent one was London Metropolitan University, which was discovered to have admitted, first of all, students who weren't there, and secondly, students who also weren't there and had purported to be there mainly in order to obtain immigration visas. And that didn't do a great deal of good for the finances or reputation of that university. And in that case, HEFG intervened essentially to support the organisation. So universities theoretically could go bust, but in the couple of cases where their financial management has reached levels at which there had to be some kind of intervention, there were public agencies that intervened to resolve it. What happens in future will interestingly remain to be seen, and this is probably a set of accidents waiting to happen, increased by the fact that universities have recently found it possible to access bond markets on quite an interesting scale. Academies, what happens when they go bust? Well, there is only one which has gone bust so far, which was the Perry Barr Academies Trust in Birmingham, an Academies Trust which, with hindsight, seems to have been rather better at attracting political hype than it was at actually running schools. It failed financially. Several others have failed simply in terms of the basic business of providing good schools. In the school sector, we have two agencies. There's an education funding agency, which is supposed to look after the money, and there is Ofsted, which is supposed to look after whether the schools are any good. These are entirely separate bodies and functions. And in truth, when academies trusts have failed, either in terms of their educational functions or financial mismanagement, and very often these have gone together, there has been a fairly inept process of sorting them out. There is no very well-defined process for sorting them out. There are things called special measures, which have been introduced in several of these cases. The same is true in relation to failed NHS trusts. The extreme case was that of Mid-Staff's NHS Trust, which is the one which has conspicuously failed, and failed on a mixture of providing negligent medical care and incompetent financial control. And that was, in effect, run at great expense until it was broken up by one of the usual suspects of firms of large chartered accountants at a cost which was ultimately excoriated by the National Audit Office. What I am describing is, I think, something of a mess. What can we learn about what works well and what works badly? I think the basic structure should be one in which we have a financial structure that one way or another provides reserves, and which also provides borrowing capacity, with clarity, which can be done in one way or the other, but it ought to be clear whether there is some parastatal organisation which stands behind the borrowing or there isn't. Because a lot of what is happening in this sector at the moment is we are paying quite a large price for the uncertainty about what the underlying reality is. So we need to think about the financial structure in this, as it were, joined up, to use a fashionable word, way. And I think we should have an overseeing board, which to my mind has to be effective. That means it has the kind of people who are capable of providing oversight of large commercial organizations and have the experience which is necessary to do so, but also understand very clearly that what their responsibilities are is to balance the social and the financial functions. And that means it should almost certainly, in almost all of these cases, be subject to some overarching regulatory supervision, appointed politically, but that regulatory supervision should be a single body which is, for the same reasons, responsible for both the financial and the social aspects of overall control. In relation to schools' trusts, for example, I've mentioned there's a body for finance, there is another body for educational standards, and there's yet another organisation called the Regional Schools Commissioner, whose functions I struggle to understand, but there are regional schools commissioners with offices all around the country. I think the basic structure should be one that has reserves, that has an effective board, that delegates day-to-day authority to executive management with that, and the boards should be appointed in such a way that they're robust to the problem of capture by the variety of interest groups who hover around any particular hybrid entity. And while I don't suggest that one size necessarily fits all the hybrids which I've described, I think the Companies Act structure extended to all of these is used in a variety of fringe ways at the moment in the hybrid sector. There are companies limited by guarantee. Legislation 15 years ago created what are called community interest companies, which sound as if they ought to be designed for this kind of thing, but which not really taken off. They do have a quite important function of ensuring that the profits or the assets can't be distributed to any particular individual. But what I would like to see, and I believe this is necessary in the context of the Companies Act as it applies to companies more generally, is a rethinking of the ideas of the overarching framework of corporate purpose, which is enshrined within the director's duties within the Companies Act. That should then be translated by articles of association of the organisation into a better definition of the particular purposes of this organisation, and that should have the financial underpinnings of the type I've described, while all the time understanding the importance of actually delegating responsibility for management effectively to people whose professional business that is. There's a quote, I use this quote from time to time. Having failed to source it, I came to think it was apocryphal. But when I said it was apocryphal, someone wrote to me with an extract from a speech by Nye Bevan, which is in fact very similar to the apocryphal quote which I had fastened on. And that was when he established the National Health Service, that the sound of a dropping bedpan in Tredegar Hospital would reverberate round the Palace of Westminster. Anyone who knows anything about business at all must know that you could not possibly run an effective organisation if that were the case. And what we have to do is ensure, on the one hand, that that isn't the case, but on the other, that not too many bedpans get dropped. And what I'm trying to talk about today is the ways in which we might actually achieve that. Thank you.